So as you know, I'm talking about social media as queer space. And if there's anything in tonight's talk or discussion that you want to follow up on, you can contact me through email. That's my Twitter handle as well. Or I'm pretty easy to find if you want to chase anything up. I've tried to give references to some of what I'm talking about, or most of what I'm talking about as I go. So I'm going to be talking about friendship, social media, and peer support among queer folk, and mostly in relation to the research I've done. So I'm not talking about the whole kind of scope of social media, just what my research has told me. So currently my focus is on mental health support for LGBTQ+ young people. But I've also looked at other social and digital media spaces such as dating and hookup apps, Facebook and other social media as well. And I'm happy, I won't talk about those today, but I'm happy if anyone wants to, we can chat about those later. What I'm interested in is the everyday practice of social media use and how often the platforms and apps we use or through use, we recontextualize those spaces. Often we queer those spaces. And I think the two examples I'm going to be talking about mostly today are Tumblr and TikTok as, I think, as key queer social media spaces. And I'll talk about why that is. All right, so I'll jump to the first slide. This is from Jeffrey Weeks and colleagues' book called Same-Sex Intimacies, which came out almost 20 years ago now. And so these sentiments echo my research findings today in relation to social media use among queer and gender diverse young people. So they state that the most commonly told relationship story among non-heterosexuals is one of friendship, and that friends offer a barrier against hostility, a sense that you're a part of an ongoing history, a school of manners and values, and a sense that there are others who are experiencing similar hopes and disappointments. So firstly, this echoes the sentiments of my research in relation to social media spaces centering friendship. And I think that's pretty obvious for most of us. Since Facebook, kind of almost, well, not quite, but almost 2 decades ago, we had this sort of friendship as a kind of central orientation to a social media platform. And even before Facebook in MySpace and Friendster and others. But secondly, it's also echoed in what these spaces offer to finding like-minded people or people like me, which are really common terms that come up in the research I do with young people and their uses of platforms like Tumblr. So Tumblr being that space to find people like me. So kind of stepping away from friends into finding peers and affiliations, and we'll touch more on that as we go. So some of what I'm talking about today is kind of, or the background for context is from a book that I've written, which will come out in December, called Digital Media, Friendship and Peer Support. There's a lot in the book, and a lot of it speaking to health research and health professionals. But some key things that underpinning today's talk are this idea that digital peer support is a form of friendship. So in the book, I look at peer education and peer support and how that's often entangled with notions of friendship. And through attention to social media, I think that peer support through, strangers often takes a form of friendship. So strangers become friends through the sites we inhabit, through these queer spaces. And digital cultures of care, in relation to that, I look at both practices of care. So, me offering care to you, for example, in a straightforward traditional sense, but also the affects involved in care and care spaces, and why somewhere like Tumblr might feel like a care space. As we scroll, we might feel cared for, even though we may not actually interact or message anyone on that platform. So next slide is Another thing, this is all for context, we'll get there eventually, but this is a paper I had published last year in Porn Studies Journal about Tumblr and pretty much the death, or the life and death of Tumblr as a queer space. In December 2018, Tumblr decided to no longer host not safe for work content and gave its users 2 weeks notice. Basically, Jeff, the CEO, posted that in 14 days we'll be taking all sexual content off Tumblr. And as you can imagine, Tumblr users were pretty outraged. Some of you may have witnessed that, some of you may have been part of that. So in that paper, I looked at responses to those messages from above, from the platform, and people really kind of getting quite angry, quite emotional about the changes that were about to happen. And thinking about it, Tumblr had been what it was for 10 to 15 years as a largely unregulated, unmoderated space where anything goes to an extent. So sexual content was fine, but also difficult topics, suicide, self-harm, those sorts of topics were also, happening in this space because of its sort of, what it had generated a sort of community that was fairly unregulated, but or maybe self-regulated is a better term. So in that paper, I talk about space, and I actually compare zines to Tumblr in a way, which we'll come back to zines in a little bit, as spaces that are kind of made within other spaces, in the cracks or in the corners of spaces that were not for queer people. But that afford certain community, connection, etc. And I say that the responses from queer users of Tumblr speak to how feelings of safety, freedom, and creativity require space that is open to many uses, many bodies, rather than a space guided by overarching rules that determine sexual content as violation. And within 2 weeks, that's what happened. If someone had posted sexual content, that user would see that watermarked. It would be invisible to everyone else, but the user who posted it would see a watermark saying, sorry, this content violates community standards. So in terms of the community and who that community is and who decides what that community is, that was, a real slap in the face to a lot of users. And we've seen Tumblr suffer greatly for that, a major loss of users. Firstly, I also want to point out too that friendship itself, or there's an argument that friendship itself is queer. And I'm not saying that these examples on screen are queer-like, as in gay or lesbian, for example, but that they queer certain norms of heteropatriarchal intimacies. They can, and sometimes they do, destabilize heteronormativity. So I'm assuming most people know these, but I'll in case not, that's from left to right, we've got Catfish, the TV show, Broad City, Spice Girls in the middle, Jackass up the top, and Rihanna and her BFF and personal assistant, Jen Rosales. And all of these stories or kind of relationships as they play out to us, whether fiction or fact, mess with ideas of friendship as we've traditionally understood it, I would say. And we can talk about that more if anyone wants to. Here are some key books on friendship over the last 4 decades. Which I believe is when friendship books sort of really started happening in terms of queer friendship in particular. So these are about or relevant to, not all of them are specifically about queer friendships, but they all offer, or give a lot of space to talking about what friendship is, and often in a queer sense. Mostly they're gay and lesbian, and I think that's important to point out as well. So by today's queer standards, these are somewhat dated. There's often a focus on either lesbian or gay communities, sometimes both. They're also very white, which again limits how we can use these texts today, although I do still think they're useful. And they also commonly centre families of choice. And also, as a lot of the books emerge from the 80s and into the 90s, they're strongly influenced by HIV/AIDS responses and how queers supported each other through that. And just actually on that last slide, I will mention there's Friendship as a Way of Life, the Tom Roach book, which is of course citing Foucault. His interview of the same name, also the name of this exhibition, of course. So Foucault's work, I think, has been very influential to my thinking about friendship because of the creative potential Foucault saw in friendship. And before his death in the early 80s, he gave a lot of time to talking about friendship in interviews and said things like, you know, we've spent a lot of time talking about the history of sex. I think maybe now we need to talk about the history of friendship. And he cited Lillian Federman's work on friendship between among women as well. Oh, sorry, no, Surpassing the Love of Women, as a kind of really important text to think about friendship as well. So Foucault says, or talks about friendship as a way of life that can be shared among individuals of different age, status, and social activity. It can yield intense relations, not resembling those that are institutionalized. And what he's referring to there pretty much is, you know, marriage and families as being the kind of center of how we understand intimacies and intimate life. And also, yeah, of course, very institutionalized forms of intimacy under the law and many other social systems. So it's important to know he is talking about gay men here, and he's talking about how friendship is a more creative way of living a gay life, rather than forging intimacy through existing institutionalized norms modeled through marriage and the family. So this work, I think it's been quite influential in queer theory, in what's often referred to as the antisocial turn of queer theory, particularly when we're talking marriage equality, and what we might miss out on if that's the path to liberation. Obviously, not everyone receives the rewards from that. And further to that is Sasha Rosen's work. And Sasha Rosen is coming from a social policy perspective, which really resonates with some of my work, which is looking at health and health systems. And she argues that if we are to understand the current state and likely future of intimacy and care, we need to foreground friendship as a social relationship and decenter the family and the heterosexual couple in our intellectual imaginaries. And so, as I mentioned, those the friendship books we looked at before, a lot of them really centered on families of choice, as this kind of idea of queer friendship. So yeah, using the family, and in a sociology of friendship, that's been really common for the last 4 decades as well. This idea that friendship is what the family isn't, so it's this kind of other space to family intimacies. And so Rosenil and many others, and many particularly queer scholars, have said, well, actually no, friendship is its own force, and we need to think about what it does and what it is beyond these notions of it being, you know, sitting separately to family. In another interview, Foucault says that society and the institutions which frame it have limited the possibility of relationships because a rich relational world would be very complex to manage, and we should fight against the impoverishment of the relational fabric. So again, he's kind of, and anyone who's familiar with Foucault's work know that he's often speaking about and against particular systems that enforce particular norms. And the family and marriage are one of those systems that he does touch on here and there. And he's again pointing to the creative potential of friendship as a space to really kind of craft and foster new forms of intimacy, connection, sex, love, etc. Okay, so next I've got the two Michelles, Michelle Foucault and Michelle Desoto, and I'm combining their approaches. I hadn't really thought about it this way until I was putting these slides together, but the book and much of my work kind of does use some of the tools that they provide in thinking about the creative potential of friendship, but also in focusing on the practice of everyday life. So what I'm saying here is combining these ideas of friendship as a way of life, as having creative potential, and this focus on everyday life as and the tactics and strategies in negotiating everyday life, as Soto talks about, highlights this everyday effective or creative space or spaces of friendship. And I think that, as we'll get to, can kind of be useful for talking about social media as well. So, I mean, it does seem questionable to center this work or my thinking on two white male French intellectuals, to be thinking about queer social media. But I think what this particular approach does offer, or it is queer enough to work, I think. But I'm willing to be tested on that as well. So bringing Foucault's subtle manifestos of queer friendships into contact with Soto's work on the tactics we use to inhabit and remodel space through everyday practice, I think is really a quite sort of useful way to think about social media and inhabiting and using and moving through and feeling those spaces. So Soto's discussion of the renter, I think, is particularly apt when we think about social media platforms like Tumblr, as I've done, because these are spaces where queer young people live, but they're also spaces that they don't own. They don't own the infrastructure. And, you know, within 2 weeks, Tumblr can turn around and basically, you know, change that space or make that space uncomfortable. However, while the infrastructure is there and available, young queers can creatively use those spaces in ways that landlords don't anticipate and may not even notice. So again, thinking about Tumblr as this sort of sprawling space where anything can happen, and a lot of the time what's happening there may not be that visible or known to a lot of other people. Hence its appeal to queer users. So, and with using Soto as well, I'm taking a cultural studies approach, and I'm interested at the level, as I mentioned, of everyday practice, but also everyday use, what this might tell us and how it might tell a wider and more complex story of how we use social media. So here's a quote from the practice of everyday life, where Soto asks, you know, all of this media is consumed, newspapers, legends, etc. But what do we know of what people do with that? So, and I think this is a really useful way to think about platforms, because we know what social media platforms are for. They tell us, they're marketed in certain ways. If you go to the App Store, it tells you exactly what to expect. But once you're in that space, you can use that space differently, depending on many factors, and particularly the affordances of that space. So, and obviously this has a long tradition in media studies that crosses with cultural studies tradition, where people have looked at certain devices and how they're used in everyday life for unintended means. So I'll just go to the next slide. So I'm not going to talk about this because I don't have time, but I do want to flag a really important point, that social media has always been queer. And here are 2 really, really nice papers that can illustrate that for you. If anyone wants to read them, I'm happy to send them out if you don't have access. Avery Dame Griff's paper talks about Usenet, which I believe is very early 90s, early internet. text-based communities. And he talks about how trans folk congregated in those spaces and forged basically what might look like a kind of online community, later into the 90s and 2000s. But the infrastructure, of course, was very different. He also talked about how not only connecting and resourcing each other, a lot of those trans people also, there were many differences within that community. So those communities fractured or split or moved away to create new communities or new spaces. And so, again, reading that paper reminded me a lot of Tumblr and other social media where people sort of, might inhabit a space for a certain time, might go and create a different space if that space is no longer comfortable, etc. So there's this sort of proliferation of spaces through different forms of kind of self creation, identity, etc. And also the Andre Cavalcanti paper talks about Susan's Place, which was an early trans forum online from the 90s onwards. It's still operating today, talking about how that has been used and really important space for trans people for decades. So one of the temptations, I think, when we talk about social media and we talk about queer young people is that, okay, isn't it great? People have TikTok now, or people had Tumblr now, but actually people have always had or made spaces on the internet in different ways. Anyway, we can come back to that if anyone has anything to add. So back in 2016, I was part of the Scrolling Beyond Binaries research team, and we surveyed and interviewed LGBTQ plus young people about social media practices. I won't read these out. I noticed we're probably running out of time, but here are some examples of some of the statements young people made about Tumblr. And as you can see, Tumblr, and these are just a few, we had actually heaps. And the interviews in particular went into a lot of detail about what Tumblr provided many young people. I think what's useful to note there is a certain intensity in people finding that space. People really kind of lit up when they told those stories. It's like, okay, I have all these words and I'm learning all these things, and I can kind of situate myself better. And often these were 18 to 20-year-olds talking about when they were 15 to 17 and discovering queer Tumblr, as though it was kind of a lifetime ago as well. But also often talking about having to leave that space, but also needing that space at a certain time. So again, there's sort of temporal moving throughness, which I think is something I'm still thinking about anyway. So I'll jump to the next slide. Not going to talk about this, but here's a whole bunch of really useful literature. The first one's from the Scrolling Beyond Binaries project. Alex Cho's work's really great, talking about Tumblr affect and the affective aspects of Tumblr and reblogging and the circulation of queer content. He also talks about or engages with young people of colour or queer people of colour. And anyway, I won't go through those, but there's some really fine examples that my work keeps referring back to anyway, and I'm happy to share some of these. So next slide is of Mark Aguilar, whose work is in this current exhibition, particularly this work, The Litanies to My Heavenly Brown Body. And so Mark had a Tumblr blog called Call Out Queen. Unfortunately, Mark died in 2012, and the images on this slide and the following slide are from a zine that two of her friends made from her blog post. So her Tumblr blog is no longer available, but the zine is, and it's kind of an interesting, I think, development in terms of, as I said before, I've sort of thought about Tumblr as a digital zine format in the kind of personal, emotional, private-ish aspects of self-publication. And interestingly, what was a Tumblr of, and still up in 2011, 2012, is now only available in zine form. And also there's a link there if anyone wants to download the zine, it's freely available, and I really recommend it. So Mark's work's a great example of queer Tumblr content. It's intersectional, it's angry, it's emotional. So here's a few more images from the blog, but also available now in the zine. So Mark's posts are often very angry. They're angry about racism, they're angry about transphobia, fat phobia, and much more. But they're also very kind of emotional, personal, revealing. There's a lot of self-photography, and there's a lot to sort of to resonate for a lot of other users of Tumblr and a lot of other queer young people, and particularly queer young people of colour or trans folk. And I really like the caption underneath the photo on the left, where she says, "My emotionality makes me stunning." And I think that's a really nice, yeah, again, a nice example of Tumblr and Tumblr's sort of politics of reclaiming self, bodies, emotions, etc., and certain forms of queerness. So on the next slide, this year actually, Sasha Velour, a winner of RuPaul's Drag Race, posted a video to YouTube, and this is a shorter clip, or an image of a shorter clip that went up on Twitter as well. And she cites Mark Aguirre as an influence of this actual piece. And it's a prayer. It's a bit like Mark's litany. And I just found that super interesting in terms of, RuPaul's Drag Race winner who probably has 1 million Instagram followers, now referencing and citing Tumblr, queer Tumblr celebrities, I guess, of a decade ago. So there's this interesting kind of circularity and movement, and moving those sort of fringe works into a more mainstream queer or gay space. Next slide is some examples of Tumblr toxicity. Actually, I think only one of them references that, but as I said, a lot of our Scrolling Beyond Binaries participants needed to get away from Tumblr after a certain amount of time, often saying things became toxic. So myself and many other Tumblr scholars talk about or use Warner's theory of counterpublics. So think about Tumblr as this sort of a counterpublic being kind of forged away from what's seen as a general public. So, a self-created space by the people in it, but also with time, sometimes those people in it really want to kind of solidify the certain values and ethics and principles of that space. And I think that was the case on Tumblr and why it had such a quick move through, because people were calling out each other quite a lot. There was a lot of lateral violence, perhaps there still is. And so this idea of toxicity, I think, is interesting because it also references the intensity of that space. Intense in both its, value and positivity and amazingness, but intense also in terms of, needing to leave and no longer being a site to support mental health, but a site that's detrimental to mental health for some young people. So I'll go now to, this is where I'm at now in my research. So I'm doing a study on digital peer support among LGBTQ young people, aged 16 to 25 years. And I've been running a survey for about a month and a half. We have around 200 responses. And one of the questions we ask is, we ask about which platforms are supportive, then we ask, well, if you had to pick one, which is the most supportive? And Instagram comes out on top, followed by TikTok, Facebook, and I will point out that's mostly in relation to Facebook groups, not Facebook itself, which was not particularly liked by most people. YouTube, Twitter, Discord, Reddit, Snapchat, and Tumblr comes in at 9th. And this is very different to what we saw in 2016. Obviously, the changes to Tumblr have made that space less supportive for LGBTQ young people. Yeah, so next slide are some examples from Tumblr, which, of course, I'm going to assume everyone here is familiar with Tumblr, even if you haven't got Tumblr, I'm sorry, TikTok. Even if you haven't got TikTok on your phone, you're going to know what TikTok is. And those of us who use TikTok, we know that its algorithm is quite sophisticated, and it very quickly picks up what you know. So if you're liking queer content, within days you're getting predominantly queer content. And a lot of users refer to this as gay TikTok. I'd question that term because I think TikTok's algorithm operates along many different lines of identity and affiliation. And gay TikTok misrepresents, the intersectional spaces that the platform definitely offers. So one key aspect of TikTok, of course, is the face-to-camera interaction. So it may involve dancing, lip syncing, response videos, role play, and more. But people usually show their faces, and that does something to the intimacy of this space. And it can also relate to a sense of being brave or comfortable with oneself or defiant, as per many queers and people of colour who assert their right to be there, sometimes dragging their racist and transphobic commentators into the foreground for public shaming, but also for public education for those who don't know what happens in the background of being visible on social media, particularly if you're a person of colour, if you're trans or queer. And a common opening address in TikTok is "Hi friends," which I think says something about friendship as well. A vernacular of friendship among strangers, unknown followers, and randoms who just happen to see your video. But again, that also suggests a sense of intimacy. And here are some quotes from the current research survey on TikTok. As you can see, people talk about it as making me feel not alone, seeing people experience similar struggles to me. And there's a lot of talk about it being more real or more authentic, people feeling at home while scrolling, filled with diversity, which I don't have in a small town, and it caters to my interests, so that the community can be really tight with people like you. So these are just some examples. What I have noticed, and you'll probably notice in those quotes, cisgender females mostly saying that TikTok is the most supportive platform for them, which I need to look more into the data and think more about that, but I'm really open to discussion of that if anyone has thoughts. Okay, I think I've got one more slide. I'm almost done. So what I want to or where I'm at with this now is thinking about the stranger as a friend and the queerness of that as well. And how that's probably totally incomprehensible for a lot of older people, for example, but people also outside queer spaces. So as I said, the opening "Hi friends" address is really common. So kind of addressing your followers or your viewers as friends. And also the intense connections are talked about as well, and the calling outs. And people often post about taking breaks, but also showing that sort of hateful, hurtful comments as well, which of course rallies their friends to get behind them, and it generates more likes, it boosts them up in the algorithm, and it kind of, gets them more fame in that space as well. So there's a lot going on there and a lot to think about. And also there's this idea that it's a more real and authentic space for queer young people is also something I'm thinking about, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that too. So final slide. I'm still running the survey and it's going to go for about another month. So, totally encourage you to, if you're under 25 and eligible, to do the survey or share it amongst your networks. That would be really awesome. And that's it. Thank you.
Great. I'm just going to pop back in here. Thank you, Paul.
Oh. Thank you.
All right. Well, we have a few questions. So I'm just going to kick off. The first question is, what happened to the queer communities on Tumblr and have they migrated to new platforms?
Good question. I'm still collecting data and I'm still looking at that and I'm not sure is the short answer. People are still using Tumblr. In those questions, there were 2 questions about support in particular, or 3 actually. The first was which platforms of all of them are supportive, and a lot of people did say Tumblr on that. But then when it came to the most, very few thought it was the most. So it's still being used. It is, but I think the volume is a lot less. And people, in terms of the unsupportive platform questions, people did talk about Tumblr there as well. Pretty much the same thing about it being a toxic space. Not much difference on that level, but certainly a space that's not as common anymore. So, and also I think some people do actually mention that they moved to Twitter, I believe. Yeah, I think that was, and maybe Reddit. Reddit does come up a bit as well.
Great. Next question. Do you think there is a specific racial significance to platforms like Tumblr and Vine? It has often been noted that these platforms created important networks and creative outlets for BIPOC communities.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And yeah, there's certainly Alex Cho's work does talk about Tumblr being for, queer people of color. And there's something, I mean, there's a lot of things here, I think. I think in terms of safety and what we're now seeing on TikTok, or what I just mentioned about TikTok as the kind of calling out, which is particularly people of color and trans folk that mostly I'm seeing doing this, Indigenous folk predominantly as well. It is this sort of, this is what I have to deal with when I'm visible and when I'm presenting as a person of color or Indigenous or trans or any number of those things. So that, I think, so I think TikTok's interesting because it does have that loop back education, like educating the white people and people who may not know what's going on. But so many trains of thought there. But I think Tumblr, not just the BIPOC community, so to speak, but I think anyone who may face a lot of hate and hateful comments or hurtful comments based on who they are, had a safer and easier time in Tumblr, because it was, you could be kind of feel like and people talk about it as being totally private and sometimes even sharing your name and face, but feeling like no one you work with, your family, and other people you don't want to see that content will actually see that content. So there's this sort of weird anonymity without that being as explicit as some other spaces as well. So that's a roundabout way. But.
Well, and I think the next question kind of like feeds on from the first 2, and it's around, are there any specifically microblogging sites similar to Tumblr that have kind of popped up that, because like Twitter and all that, they have a different format and they're not like Tumblr in the same, microblogging sense. Yeah.
They have, but I don't think any of them have been, or at least none that I know of. And someone else, feel free to comment if you know of spaces that do exist. I mean, there was one called the New Tumblr. I forget all the names, but there are a whole bunch that came out pretty much within weeks or months of Tumblr going, banning not safe for work content. And even on the platform in those 2 weeks, people were using Tumblr to talk about, okay, where do we go now? I think in terms of a lot of the porn and sex work, although sex goes so well on Twitter a lot of the time, but a lot of the porn bloggers went to Twitter. And I think that's because of the volume of users. So there's an audience on Twitter. All of the new kind of microblogging sites didn't yet have an audience. So there were a lot of people going, everyone come here, everyone, I've got a space here, you should all bring your stuff. to my knowledge, that didn't really play out well.
So it almost fractured in a sense.
Yeah, if there was sort of one space that people would go, but also where people did land, and some people, of course, went to Instagram as a kind of doorway to something else as well. So here's my Instagram, which of course is clean and safe for work, but you know, here's my link tree that might take you
somewhere else.
Yeah.
And we just have a comment about Mark. Mark's family deleted her Tumblr Call Out Queen after her death, but it has been archived and preserved and can be easily found online. I think you mentioned that. Did
I said the Tumblr was down. I said there's a zine, which
yeah.
I mean that's good to know that it's been archived.
Yeah.
Thank you.
There's another question around TikTok. How do people do queer on TikTok?
That's a really good question. I was thinking about that when I was, putting this together, and spending a lot of time on TikTok in the last month, I must say. But I think queerness, a bit like Tumblr, and maybe just like queerness in general, it's played out in so many ways. Like there are a lot of young people being kind of super about identity and like, this is how I identify, and this is my flag, and this is, this is me. But then there's also just really kind of queer in the sense of performative, strange, odd, media production, which I would see as sort of queer, maybe not so much in an identity space, or maybe, crossing both those axes of queerness. So I think, I don't know, I'm still, as I said, thinking about TikTok, and I'm really keen to chat to other TikTok researchers and users and fans, and hopefully in the interviews I do next year, I'll explore this in more depth. But I'm interested in that, the gay TikTok I mentioned, which is certainly talked about in media articles a lot, and young people themselves talk about, I'm on gay TikTok, and straight TikTok is also seen as, quite ridiculous and strange for many queer young people. So there's these sorts of divisions, but I think, as I mentioned, I think the algorithm doesn't just sort along those lines. I think there's also a black TikTok, and we've seen in black TikTok and so-called gay TikTok, there's been content moderation stuff happening.
Yes. Yeah.
People who so TikTok didn't show content, or they reduced content for queer, fat, and disabled people I think that was last year, maybe the year before, and copped a lot of flack for that. Of course, their reason was they didn't want people to be bullied. So if we don't show their content, which is actually usually quite politically motivated. It's like, here I am, this is me, I can have this space, and then TikTok taking that down to protect those people, which was, a strange and bad move, but it didn't do them any favors, I don't think.
Yeah, I feel like that's one of the complicated threads of like underlying all this conversation, which is, they're capitalist, surveillance capitalist frameworks that everyone's expressing themselves under, and it's not like they're queer owned, you would say, or anything like that.
But I think, that's the sort of, point I'm making about queer space, or occupying or making queer space. It's often queers throughout history haven't had spaces to call their own. They haven't had the kind of capital to sort of, that's shifting, and maybe it depends on where you're sort of looking and what you're looking at. But that's certainly, there's a certain tactics to operating in these kind of huge corporate spaces.
I'm going to jump to another question. Do you use these spaces or just study them? I'm interested if your personal use has influenced your reading and understanding of these spaces.
That's a great question. I did have, and I cut it out because I had too much to say. I was going to kind of set up my research, like, and obviously out myself. You can see me, I'm not a young person. But my research is really kind of motivated by thinking about the complexity of the stories that young people share in a research space. So my main motivation is research. I obviously have my own, politics, queer politics, etc., that do meet in that space as well. But also I do use these spaces. I have posted content on TikTok. I got about 17 likes on one of them. But I found that I'm not much a face to camera person. So my posts were not me, and I didn't feel comfortable doing that, which of course means I will never travel far on TikTok. But I have spent a lot of time on the space as a viewer, which I think is really common. I talk to my students about it often as well. Like a lot of people on TikTok aren't actually on TikTok in that they're posting videos. They're mostly consuming content.
Yeah.
And I think Tumblr was a little bit the same based on some of the interviews. I've used Tumblr, but also my use of Tumblr, being a lot older than the young people I've engaged with, was not anything comparable to their use. I wasn't a 16-year-old on Tumblr. I've heard the stories and I've really enjoyed and got a lot from those stories of the 16-year-old or 15-year-old on Tumblr. But that's nothing I can relate to. When I was that age, I was somewhere else entirely. But yeah, I do use them. But obviously, that does influence in some ways. But not completely.
Just trying to. How far do you think algorithms lead to the racialization of queer spaces on Tumblr? And/or what else do you think leads to the ghettoization of queerness on Tumblr and other such platforms?
Okay. So was the first bit about Tumblr or TikTok, the algorithms?
It's talking about the algorithms on Tumblr.
On Tumblr, okay.
Yeah.
I don't know much about algorithms, I will be honest. That's not an area of my expertise. Other than my engagement as a user. I've read a little bit on it. I hesitate to kind of speak to it from a knowing perspective. But I'm aware that, from use, but also from what I've read, TikTok has a very sophisticated algorithm, as I mentioned. I don't really know about Tumblr's algorithm. And I think particularly back in the day where a lot of participants were using it, which would have been more, that could be pushing 10 years ago now for some of the scrolling beyond binaries interviews and surveys we did. I think the algorithm wouldn't have been very sophisticated back then. It's something that, again, it kind of, it's hard to navigate that over time and across platforms, I think. And also, none of us really know how a platform's algorithm works, except the architects behind that platform. So
yeah, the dark side.
Yeah.
Have you observed how this digital peer support that you've been talking about moves into the real world? Are they separate or are they intertwined?
Yeah, I think they're intertwined, but in really kind of different, diverse ways as well. So some of the scrolling beyond binaries, so the 2016 interviews I did, people talked about Tumblr actually kind of inadvertently making friends on Tumblr, and so meeting up in real life and maybe going to gigs together, or maybe if they travel to each other's cities, they'd meet up. And so that support would continue. And also if people left Tumblr, they'd move to Twitter. And so the relationships continue and change across platforms, and maybe even people meet in person. So there's that level. There's I'm not sure exactly where the question's coming from, but in terms of support, whether there's also the kind of moving from peer support in a digital sense to actual mental health support with professionals or counsellors. I think that's also happening too. A lot of the time people might, explore their feelings and what they're going through in a safe, sort of anonymous digital space before they take that next step to seek help, if that's what's needed. That's certainly happening as well. And yeah, the thing that I was meant to talk about but didn't get to as well was some of my participants in some other research, queer young people, have talked about not talking about mental health with their friends, which I found quite interesting, because, and I mean, it makes sense. So we know still from the research that's happening that a lot of queer and trans young people are not having a great time with their families. A lot are these days, but a lot still are not. So families can be a hostile space, the home can be hostile. Friendships at school or uni or whatever can be a really safe space, and an intensely safe space. So to kind of bring one's mental health into that space, some of the young people I've spoken to have talked about that as a risk. So you don't want to contaminate that space. You don't want to be the mental health friend. You don't want to be the person that everyone's checking in on. Like, you want that space to be what it always has been, fun, safe, etc. So a lot of people have talked about going to Tumblr and similar spaces to do that mental health work, which I find quite interesting. And so keeping friends and digital friends a little bit separate. I don't know how long that might last. I think every case is really different. So the diversity there, I think, is important to note as well.
Any thoughts on how services trying to work with young people can best use social media without looking like that "Hello, fellow kids" gif?
Yeah, I mean, I have done some research on that in terms of sexual health promotion and Facebook many years ago. And I sort of, I don't know that it is possible. I think it'd be nice, but I think maybe it is services that actually have and invest in peer support can offer that. So, real actual young people doing that work, and maybe doing that work on TikTok. I think that's possible. I think you do see ads on TikTok. I keep seeing ads for University of Wollongong at the moment on my TikTok, and it jars. You're like scrolling through all this sort of ridiculousness, queerness, whatever, and then suddenly there's like, hey, kids, come and study at Wollongong, and it's like, it's a very quick scroll. You get that vibe pretty quickly. So I think I mean, I don't want to rule it out. I think it can be done. And I think it has to be done creatively, and it has to kind of maybe challenge a lot of the infrastructures of public health promotion, health and community services. These services are very, risk averse in a sense that everything has to be checked and move up the chain and then down the chain before it can be released and actually happen. And I think through that process, there's a lot of thought goes into, well, it depends on the organization, but if it's an NGO, they might be thinking about their funders. They might be thinking about, who's might not enjoy this thing, and what's at stake in terms of the institution itself. So the goals of the institution usually take precedence. If there were ways where people could just, and not in a sort of dodgy peer support or peer education, which I totally critique in the book, where peers are trained to help each other, but in a sense where people actually do have a bit more, young people have free range. And many young people in the research I've done have said, well, actually, doctors should tell people to go to Tumblr, and have said things like that, because it's, from a space of knowing that that's what they needed, that's probably what their peers need, and they probably don't need a brochure in a clinic or even a kind of the meme that was referenced there.